What if the money in your pocket stopped working tomorrow, not because of a war, not because of a headline, but because the system behind it quietly snapped? No warning sirens, no emergency broadcast. Just a moment, so ordinary you'd almost miss it. And yet, nothing would ever be the same again. Picture a normal Tuesday. You walk into a grocery store you've been in 100 times before. Fluorescent lights overhead, the low mechanical hum of refrigerators. You grab bread, eggs, milk, routine stuff, the kind of purchases that don't require thought because you've been trained your entire life to believe this part of reality is stable. At the checkout, you pull out a $20 bill, the same paper you've trusted for decades, the same green ink, the same dead presidents. The cashier looks at it, hesitates just a second too long, then slides it back across the counter and says, calmly, almost apologetically, "We don't take those anymore. No riots break out, no markets crash on live TV. Civilization doesn't end with an explosion, it ends with a sentence. Quiet, administrative, final." Most people think money has value because governments say it does. That belief feels safe, it feels permanent, and it's completely false. Your dollar works today for one reason, and one reason only a secret deal struck more than 50 years ago, behind closed doors. In a desert kingdom, a deal that forced the rest of the world to need American currency whether it wanted to or not. That deal is coming apart. And when it finally does, the collapse won't look like a bomb going off. It will look like a bill coming due, right when you realize you can't afford to pay it. For decades, Americans were fed a simple, comforting fairy tale about how the dollar came to rule the world. We were told it was because America worked harder, invented better, built faster, that our currency dominated because our factories were stronger, our ideas brighter, our system superior. It sounded logical, it sounded earned. And because it sounded good, almost no one asked the dangerous follow-up question, what actually keeps this thing alive? The story went further. Deficits didn't matter. Debt was just a number on a screen. Money printing was safe because we were different, because we were exceptional. And for a long time, the results seemed to prove it. The U.S. ran trade deficits year after year. It imported far more than it exported. It consumed more than it produced. And nothing broke. Stores stayed full, gas flowed, credit stayed cheap. To most people, that looked like success. But that story skips the mechanism entirely. It skips the part where the dollar stops being just a currency and becomes infrastructure. After 1971, when the gold window closed and the dollar lost its last anchor, something had to replace trust. That replacement wasn't productivity, it was necessity. Energy, oil, the lifeblood of every modern economy. No oil means no trucks, no factories, no food on shelves, no lights in homes. You can't substitute it. You can't negotiate with it. After 1974, the global system was quietly rewired so that oil could only be bought with U.S. dollars. That single rule changed everything. If a country needed energy, it first needed dollars. If it needed dollars, it had to earn them by exporting real goods and real labor, usually to the United States. The U.S. didn't have to export value at the same scale. It exported currency, paper, digits, claims. That's when the illusion began. America looked rich not because it was producing everything, but because it sat at the toll booth of the global energy system. Dollars flowed out, goods flowed in, and the bill never seemed to arrive. The dollar wasn't dominant because the world loved it. It was dominant because the world couldn't function without touching it. Think of it like oxygen pipes in a building. You don't argue about the price when you're suffocating. You pay whatever is demanded. For decades, the dollar was that pipe, invisible, assumed, untouchable. But here's the part the fairy tale leaves out: systems built on obligation don't collapse when people get angry. They collapse when people find another way to breathe. And once the mandate weakens, once energy can move without passing through the dollar, everything that looked like prosperity starts to look like leverage that's slipping out of grip. What seemed permanent begins to feel conditional. And history is unforgiving to systems that confuse control with loyalty. To really understand how this system was born, you have to step back into the early 1970s when the American financial machine started making noises it wasn't supposed to make. For decades after World War II, the rules were simple. The dollar was tied to gold. Foreign governments could take their dollars and exchange them for a fixed amount of metal sitting in U.S. vaults. It wasn't perfect, but it created trust. A dollar was a claim on something real. That balance began to crack as the S. Spent heavily on the Vietnam War while simultaneously expanding domestic programs at home. More dollars were created to pay the bills, but the gold didn't multiply with them. By the late 1960s, the gap was obvious. There were far more claims than collateral. Foreign governments, led most aggressively by France, noticed. They started calling in those claims, asking for physical gold instead of paper promises. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that changed the financial world forever. He closed the gold window, no warning, no vote, just an announcement. Overnight, the dollar stopped being a receipt for gold and became a piece of paper backed only by confidence. The United States didn't call it a default, but functionally, that's exactly what it was. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Inflation surged as trust evaporated. The value of the dollar fell, markets shook, and just as the system was wobbling, geopolitics poured gasoline on the fire. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil producers imposed an embargo on nations that supported Israel, including the United States. Energy prices exploded, gas prices quadrupled, Americans waited in lines for hours just to fill their tanks. Fights broke out at gas stations. The stock market collapsed, losing roughly 45% of its value. By 1974, the situation was no longer theoretical. The U.S. wasn't just dealing with inflation or a recession. It was facing a credibility crisis. The dollar had no gold behind it. The country had no control over energy supply, and without energy, the modern economy doesn't function. Factories stall, transportation freezes, food stops moving, the lights go out. This is the moment most people miss. The crisis wasn't just economic, it was structural. The dollar wasn't dying because Americans stopped believing in it. It was dying because there was no longer a hard reason for the rest of the world to hold it. Confidence alone can't support a global system. Something stronger had to replace gold, something no country could live without. That realization didn't come from a textbook, it came from desperation, and it set the stage for a deal that would quietly rewire the global economy for the next half century. By the summer of 1974, Washington was out of good options. The dollar had been cut loose from gold, inflation was burning through the economy, oil prices had exploded, and the United States was staring at a future where its currency might slowly bleed out on the global stage. That's when William Simon entered the picture. He wasn't a politician by instinct. He was a bond trader by training. He understood markets the way surgeons understand arteries. And he understood one rule that mattered more than all the speeches combined: a currency lives or dies based on demand, not promises. In July 1974, Simon boarded a plane to Saudi Arabia under the cover of routine diplomacy. Officially, it was a standard visit. Unofficially, it was a rescue mission. He arrived in Jeddah with a message that wasn't written down and couldn't leak. What he offered wasn't ideology or friendship. It was protection. In a region surrounded by rivals and instability, America would become the ultimate guarantor of the Saudi royal family's survival. Advanced weapons, intelligence sharing, military backing. If anyone threatened the House of Saud, the United States would step in. The price for that protection was precise and non-negotiable. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in US dollars, not gold, not German marks, not yen, dollars. And because Saudi Arabia dominated OPEC, that rule would cascade outward. Every major oil producer would follow the same pricing standard. Energy, the lifeblood of the global economy, would now move through a single currency. On top of that, the Saudis wouldn't just sit on the mountains of dollars they earned. They would recycle those oil profits back into the United States by buying U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively financing America's growing debt. This is where the machine comes into view. If a country needed oil, it first needed dollars. To get dollars, it had to export real things: cars, electronics, raw materials, labor to the United States. America, meanwhile, didn't have to ship equivalent value back. It issued currency, the paper went out, the goods came in, and the dollars that accumulated overseas circled back as loans to the U.S. government to keep the arrangement from igniting political backlash in the Middle East. Secrecy was essential. Simon quietly created special treasury mechanisms that allowed the Saudi central bank to buy massive amounts of U.S. debt without going through public auctions. No headlines, no paper trail visible to the public. This hidden channel stayed buried for decades, until a Freedom of Information Act request in 2016 forced the Treasury to acknowledge the scale of Saudi holdings. What emerged wasn't free markets doing their thing. It was design, a closed loop. Oil created dollar demand. Dollar demand financed U.S. deficits. U.S. power protected the oil flow. Once it locked into place, the system didn't need trust. It ran on necessity. And that's what made it so powerful and so dangerous once cracks began to form. Once the architecture was in place, it couldn't be allowed to remain theoretical. A system this powerful only survives if everyone believes the cost of disobedience is higher than the cost of compliance. And history shows, with uncomfortable clarity, what happened when that line was tested. In November 2000, Saddam Hussein made a move that barely registered with the public at the time, but sent a cold shock through financial circles. Iraq announced it would no longer accept USD dollars for its oil. From that moment forward, payment would be required in euros. On the surface, it looked irrational. The euro was still young, barely a year old as an accounting currency, and it was weak. Trading near 82 cents to the dollar, analysts mocked the decision. They said Iraq was sabotaging its own revenue for political theater. At first, the critics were right. Pricing oil in a depreciating currency cost Iraq money. But then, the environment shifted. Between 2001 and 2002, the euro began to rise. It climbed back to parity with the dollar and then pushed higher. Quietly, Iraq's oil revenue started outperforming what it would have earned under dollar pricing. What had looked like stubborn defiance began to look like a proof of concept. That's when the danger became real. Iraq wasn't just selling oil in euros, it was demonstrating that the dollar was optional. If one major oil producer could do it and come out ahead, others might follow. And if OPEC followed, the entire mechanism holding up global dollar demand would start to unravel. This wasn't about Iraq's economy, it was about contagion. The response unfolded with grim precision. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The public rationale centered on weapons of mass destruction and security threats. But the financial timeline tells a quieter story. Within weeks of Baghdad falling, before a new government was in place, before reconstruction plans were finalized, before democracy was even discussed, one of the first economic decisions was made. Iraqi oil sales were switched back to U.S. dollars. The euro account was closed. The experiment ended. The message didn't need to be announced. It was understood. A decade later, the challenge came from a different direction. Muammar Gaddafi didn't propose switching currencies. He proposed replacing the system entirely. His vision was a gold-backed African currency, the gold dinar, designed to allow African nations to sell oil and resources without relying on dollars or euros. Libya had the means to attempt it. The country held roughly 143 tons of gold, enough to anchor the project and threaten the existing order, particularly France's control over the CFA franc system across large parts of Africa. In 2011, NATO intervened in Libya. Gaddafi was captured and killed. The Libyan state collapsed into chaos, and the gold disappeared. The proposed currency vanished with it. Twice, the same pattern repeated. A challenge emerged. The mechanism was threatened. Force restored the status quo. The petrodollar survived, not because it was loved, but because it was defended. And every act of enforcement carried a lesson for those watching closely. This system was not voluntary. It was structural. And stepping outside it came with consequences that echoed far beyond economics. For decades, the dollar-based system rested on a single, fragile assumption that almost no one questioned neutrality. The idea was that the dollar was just plumbing, a utility, a neutral medium everyone could use, regardless of politics. You could dislike Washington, oppose its wars, reject its values, and still hold dollars safely. That belief was the glue holding the system together. It shattered in February 2022, when Russian troops crossed into Ukraine. The Western response went far beyond sanctions as the world had known them. The United States, the European Union, and their allies froze roughly $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves. At the same time, major Russian banks were expelled from SWIFT, the messaging system that allows banks to communicate across borders. This wasn't a warning shot. It was a demonstration of absolute power. For the first time, a G20 economy discovered a brutal truth in real time. Those reserves Russia had accumulated, earned by selling oil and gas, stored in what it believed were safe Western institutions, weren't assets at all. They were permissions, and those permissions could be revoked overnight. The shock rippled far beyond Moscow. Central bankers around the world were watching the same screens, doing the same math. If it could happen to Russia, it could happen to anyone. Money that could be frozen wasn't sovereign wealth. It was conditional wealth. Russia didn't respond with the speeches. It responded with the mechanics. In March 2022, it announced that unfriendly countries would have to pay for Russian natural gas in rubles. Europe objected loudly. Contracts were cited, rules were invoked, then reality intervened. Energy shortages don't care about legal arguments. Europe needed the gas. Complex payment structures were set up. Euros were converted. Rubles were used. The demand did its work. The ruble recovered from its initial collapse. Energy that once flowed west began flowing east instead. Russia deepened trade ties with China and India. Oil and gas moved in exchange for yuan, rupees, and dirhams. Tankers sailed without Western insurance. Payments cleared outside traditional channels. What collapsed wasn't Russia's economy. It was an illusion. The illusion that the dollar system was unavoidable. The illusion that sanctions were a one-way weapon. The illusion that commodities needed dollars more than dollars needed commodities. In one move, the financial nuclear option revealed its own weakness. By weaponizing the system at its core, the West proved that neutrality was gone. And once neutrality disappears, trust follows it out the door. From that moment on, the question for the rest of the world wasn't whether the dollar could be replaced. It was how fast an escape route could be built before the switch was flipped on them next. What we're living through right now doesn't feel like collapse, and that's exactly why it's so dangerous. Shelves are still stocked, markets still open, the dollar still works. To most people, nothing appears broken, but history rarely announces turning points with alarms. It reveals them through quiet rewiring, and that rewiring is already well underway. The shift didn't begin with Russia or sanctions. It began years earlier, almost unnoticed. In 2018, China launched yuan-denominated oil futures through the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. On paper, it looked technical, boring, easy to ignore, but buried inside that contract was the real innovation. Those yuan weren't a dead end. They were linked directly to gold through Shanghai's gold exchanges. An oil producer could sell crude, receive yuan, and immediately convert that currency into physical gold. No dollars involved. No American banks, no SWIFT messages lighting up screens in New York. Just oil for gold, with the yuan acting as a temporary bridge. This solved the problem that had always stopped alternatives to the dollar. Oil exporters didn't trust holding foreign paper they couldn't freely move or spend. Gold changed that. Gold doesn't care about sanctions. It can't be frozen with a keystroke. Once that door opened, the system stopped being theoretical. It became usable. Others noticed, especially Saudi Arabia. For decades, the kingdom had been the cornerstone of the dollar's energy dominance. But by 2023, Saudi officials were openly saying something that would have been unthinkable. A generation or earlier, oil could be settled in multiple currencies. Dollars, euros, others. The sentence was calm. The implication was seismic. Exclusivity was gone. At the same time, BRICS expanded, pulling in major energy producers and trade hubs. Parallel payment systems grew. Central bank digital currencies moved from white papers into live testing. Each development alone looked manageable. Together, they formed an escape route. This is a stage most people misunderstand. The petrodollar hasn't vanished. Oil is still priced largely in dollars. Treasuries are still held, but the monopoly is broken. And history is unforgiving on this point. Every reserve currency that lost its monopoly didn't collapse overnight. It faded. Slowly at first, then all at once. We're not watching the other end of the dollar. We're watching the end of a world where there was no alternative. And once that door opens, it never closes again. Empires don't end the way movies teach us to expect. There's no single day where the flag comes down and everyone agrees it's over. Real empires fade when the numbers stop working. When the math that once felt abstract starts showing up in everyday life. When interest payments quietly grow larger than defense budgets. When national debt climbs past $35 trillion. When the rest of the world no longer wants to absorb the cost of your choices. For half a century, the United States ran a unique arrangement. When it printed too much money, that inflation didn't stay home. It leaked outward. Dollars flowed overseas to buy oil, goods, labor, and those dollars stayed there. Parked in foreign reserves and bond portfolios, the world acted like a sponge, soaking up America's excess so prices at home stayed relatively calm. That wasn't discipline. It was privilege. but privileges only last as long as the system supporting them does. As demand for dollars weakens, that sponge dries out. The inflation doesn't disappear, it reverses direction. It comes back, not all at once, not with flashing headlines, but quietly, relentlessly, in rent that jumps faster than wages, in groceries that cost more every month, in energy bills that refuse to go back down, in savings accounts that look stable while buying less every year. This is where people get confused. They look for villains, politicians, foreign enemies, bad decisions. But what's happening isn't moral failure, it's mechanical. Systems built on leverage always follow the same arc. First comes trust, then scale, then abuse, and finally, replacement. Not because anyone planned it, but because incentives made it inevitable. Every reserve currency in history walked this path. The Dutch guilder, the British pound, each dominated global trade until the weight of debt and obligation bent the system too far. None of them collapsed overnight. They lingered, they argued, they denied, then one day they woke up irrelevant. The dollar isn't special in that sense. It never was. It's protected by size, power, and inertia, not immunity. What makes this moment unsettling isn't that the dollar is failing, it's that it's entering the late stage of a cycle people were taught could never end. Empires don't fall loudly. They fade while most people are still arguing about whether anything is wrong, and by the time the truth feels obvious, the options are already gone. You don't need to panic. Panic is what people do when they realize too late that they never bothered to understand the rules of the game they were living inside. What matters now isn't fear, it's clarity. History doesn't repeat because people are ignorant or foolish. It repeats because systems are designed to reward denial for as long as they possibly can. As long as things still mostly work. As long as shelves are stocked and screens stay green, the pressure to look away is overwhelming. And that's why the most dangerous moment is never the crash itself. It's the calm right before it, when everything still feels normal enough to ignore. We've walked through the mechanics, the deals, the enforcement, and the quiet shifts already underway. None of this means the world is ending tomorrow. It means the rules that governed the last half century are losing their grip. Systems don't vanish in a single headline. They erode, they adapt, and then they're replaced by something new that most people didn't see coming. The uncomfortable truth is that every major transition looks obvious in hindsight and invisible in real time. The people who get hurt aren't the ones who lacked intelligence. They're the ones who assumed the system would always work the way it always had. The people who adapt are the ones who stay curious, who watch incentives instead of slogans, who understand which stage of the cycle they're standing in. The end of one system is never the end of history. It's the opening chapter of the next one. And in moments like this, when the old rules are still in place but no longer guaranteed, understanding isn't just power, it's the only edge that's ever been real.